you know, familiar with.
They'll be fairly sophisticated and worldly.
These bright lights help with keeping me awake. We're out of in the zone.
Good afternoon, and welcome to this, the first of the events organized by the Qatar Museums to celebrate the opening of the new National Gallery. My name is Donald Baker, and I'm the Executive Dean of BCU's School of Arts here in Qatar. So let me welcome you as well to our campus. If you haven't been here before, this is a remarkable site for artistic creativity and a bastion in the artistic community here in Qatar. The theme of the session is of considerable interest to people in art education. The title is From the Art School to the Art World, Preparing a New Generation of Artists, Designers, and Art Professionals for the Future. Like you, I'm looking forward to hearing what our distinguished speakers will say about that important theme. My second duty is to introduce the moderator of the session, Dr. Jelena Trkulja, who in turn will introduce the speakers and begin the questioning as well. Dr. Jelena was born in Serbia but received her higher education in the United States. She earned a BA at Mount Holyoke, an MA in French and German at Amherst, and an MA and a PhD at Princeton. After beginning with academic appointments in Serbia and 2 years as a lecturer and postdoctoral fellow at Princeton, she moved from academia into the world of work herself, first as a consultant for education strategy for Qatar Museums, and then since 2013 as its director of education. And in that capacity, she has organized many lectures and exhibits, including those related to Qatar's annual designation of a country for cultural partnership. This year it is India, and last year with works addressing the plight of refugees. All that she does is inspired by an educational purpose. So with that, let me welcome Dr. Trkulja to the stage.
Hello? Better. The Earl of Snowdon, also known as David Linley, is to my right. Lord Snowdon's passion for the arts was nurtured at Bauhaus School, renowned for its emphasis on the arts and crafts. His creative ability and avid interest in woodworking led him to hone these skills at Parnham House School for Craftsmen in Wood. In 1985, Snowdon established a business focusing on the design and production of bespoke furniture. The company, Linley, has since achieved international renown for a luxury interior design, furniture, and accessories of the highest quality, created with inventiveness and meticulous attention to detail. In 2006, Snowdon was appointed chairman of Christie's UK, and in 2015, honorary chairman for Christie's Emery. Since 2018, Snowdon is also vice president of the Princess Foundation, an organization which teaches traditional arts and skills for building sustainable housing and regenerating neighborhoods. Thank you.
That's all true.
Yes. Our second speaker is President Rosanne Somerson, a designer, professor, and academic leader. President Rosanne Somerson has been advancing art and design since she was a student at Rhode Island School of Design in the 1970s. She returned to the college in the 1980s to teach, and in 1995 founded the Furniture Design Department before serving as provost and chief academic officer. As RISD's 17th president, she is committed to expanding inclusion, equity, and access in order to enhance a genuinely rich learning environment that consists of diverse experiences, viewpoints, and talents. President Summerson also maintains a creative practice, designing and creating furniture for exhibitions and commissions, and frequently speaks and writes about the power of critical thinking and making, underscoring the value of art and design to advance life in the 21st century. To her right is Dean Marta Kuzma. Marta is the Dean and the Professor of Art at Yale School of Art at Yale University, where she's also a tenured Professor of Art in Critical Studies. Dean Kuzma had been appointed to the Yale School of Art in August 2016 as the first woman to hold the Dean position in the school's 150-year-long history. Prior to this appointment, Marta Kuzma served as Vice Chancellor of the Royal Institute of Art in Stockholm, Sweden, where she was also the first woman in such a position. Over the past 3 decades, Marta Kuzma has worked as a curator, an educator, and a cultural producer, mapping the bloodlines that connect artistic practice with the contexts where it emerges and it operates. As director of the Office for Contemporary Art Norway for 8 years, from 2005 to 2013, she established the OCA Semesterplan, an internationally recognized research-based program of exhibitions, lectures, seminars, and projects, which addressed art practice in relation to wider cultural and social contexts. Last but not least, Dean Shawn Brixey. Professor Shawn Brixey is Dean of the School of the Arts, or VCU Arts, Special Assistant to the Provost of the School of the Arts in Qatar, and Affiliate Professor in the College of Engineering at Virginia Commonwealth University. Brixey is an artist, educator, researcher, writer, and inventor, working primarily at the interface of art, science, and technology. Preceding his appointment as Dean at VCU, Brixey was Dean of the School of the Arts, Media, Performance, and Design at York University in Toronto, Canada. Brixey is the former Floyd and Dolores Jones Endowed Chair for Arts, as well as co-founder and former director of the Pioneering Research Center and doctoral program. This is the Center for Digital Arts and Experimental Media at the University of Washington in Seattle. A graduate of MIT's Media Lab, Brixey has exhibited art and technology works internationally. He speaks on issues intersecting the arts, design, technology, culture, higher education, and university administration. Critical writing and reviews of his work and thinking on these topics have been featured in major journals and across digital media channels. Brixey has received all levels of major grants and awards. Intel Corporation, the National Science Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and Hughes Aircrafts. So with this amazing panel that we have today, I ask you to help me welcome the panel and start the discussion now. Thank you. I wanted to begin the talk about the future of art education by looking at the past of art education. And I would like to address the first question to you, President Somerson. Could you tell us a little bit about what has changed in art education over the course of history, and what is it different now?
Okay, so I will, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. So I will try and give a very abbreviated history. Good luck. We have just a short time, but I will say that I want to start with a premise, which is that the form of art history has always evolved over time based on what the needs of societies were at the time, which also links to the notion that art education is very much tied into the cultural idioms of the time. And I also want to say that I'm not going to talk about the art history, the education or history in huge regions of the world like the East or Africa, where very different systems were in play. But I will talk about the Western derivation of art education in a kind of abbreviated way. So if we want to start, I'll start at the Middle Ages. And in the time of the Middle Ages, there was really a notion about artisanal training, about the idea of a guild system, and the guild system was the original system for education in the arts. And it was the whole system of apprenticeships, masters, journeymen, etc., that where individuals, young people, went directly from grammar school into the guild structure. And as that progressed into the Renaissance, and you can see we're going through history very quickly, the artists themselves rebelled from the guild system, thinking that it was really based on professions. They wanted to be considered more professionals than artisans. And so they demanded that the liberal arts be integrated into their educational system. And so the art academies began shortly after that period. So in the most famous beginning of the art academy was in Florence in 1560. And in Florence, in the art academies, theory was brought in as being equally important as to practice. So now we're evolving into the notion of the university setting for the study of art. But at the same time, art in that context became very formulaic, and there was a real discouragement for originality, because there was a kind of mode of learning, and that mode was followed master versus student, and the notion of originality was very much pushed out of the system of the art academies. And so that then led, as you can see, sort of bouncing back and forth from one thing changing to another, the Romantic Rebellion, when the notion of originality and creativity really came into play. And it was really through the early German Romantics that this transformation happened. And at that particular point in time, creative freedom was prized by young people who were increasingly going into the practices of art and design, really it was the arts at that point, because they wanted to have this sense of originality and creativity. However, one of the limitations of the form of education at the time was that there was a belief that art was sort of the spiritual, romantic notion, and it could not be taught, but technique could be taught. So there was a heavy emphasis on technique. And then in Britain, actually, when the roots of modern art education formed in Britain around, we're now moving ahead a couple of hundred years into the notion of industrial design education. And in that realm, where art education really began to evolve, there was a strong sense that materials and production methods should dictate form, and as well as function. So it was really the first time that the notion of the design elements were brought into the foray of art education. And famously, William Morris and John Ruskin raged against what was happening in the Industrial Revolution and industrialized goods, and asked us to consider the role of the hand and unifying art and craft, and actually returning in some ways to the guild system, but with more of an intellectual component added into the earlier structure. But there were two distinct curriculums, one that was for instruction in fine and industrial art, and one that had the notion that the fine arts were supreme, and that the fine arts could be translated into the decorative arts. So these were two different approaches, different philosophical approaches. But the reaction was against the machine age and the notion of the fact that artisans were a specialized form of education. So, and the quality of the objects they made them very costly. So there evolved something where now art was supported. Artisans were supported by a class of people that were buying their work. And that allowed more and more people to become involved with the arts. And then we go into the 20th century, and again, I'm moving very quickly. I could speak for a long time about each of these times, but the Wiener Werkstatt started in Vienna, and the notion there was that the Koloman Moser and Joseph Hoffman established the school, and the notion was that they wanted to be forward-looking rather than looking into the past. And so they brought a lot of aesthetic questions into how one described the future through arts and design and the integration of decorative objects and arts and design. And their philosophy inspired then Walter Gropius, who became one of the originators of the Bauhaus. And the Bauhaus formed a very important educational model that really still in some ways has influence today, although there are people that are defying the principles of the Bauhaus. But the Bauhaus started in 1919, and their initial intention was, and this is a quote, to create a new guild of craftsmen without the class distinctions which raise an arrogant barrier between craftsmen and artists. So now they're trying to unite the notion of craft and art and to sort of break with history in a way to teach artists in an entirely new age, looking at what the cultural requirements were of that time. And in their foundation program, their first year program, a famous foundation's faculty member, Joseph Itten, fine artist, had a 6-month foundational course that had 3 strong elements of pedagogy: training the hand and the senses, training the emotions, and training the mind. So now we get a sense of the broader culture being brought into the educational model. And although skills and technique were very important, the Bauhaus philosophy really drew on the individual and the role of the individual in a uniquely creative way, and responded to the world around the artists themselves. So that mode of education has really continued pretty strongly into the contemporary role of art and design education, although I think there's a whole other conversation, which I won't make, about how that's changing now. So I think we'll get into some of that in the future. But I want to just draw that thread through history, saying that as you look at the way that the programs were structured, they were really structured around how societies needed to advance in their time. And so the question that I would leave with, talking about what art education is now, is for us to consider, as you listen to the thoughts of the other panelists, what are the things that we need now in our cultures and societies? Why is art education particularly poised to help us to educate students to achieve those? And how do we look from our posture now into the future? So I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you for that wonderful overview, which I think sets us nicely on the course of looking at what are the latest developments. So I will pose a question to you, Shawn. What do you see as the greatest development in the last 20 years in art education?
Thank you, Roseann, for sort of setting the table. And thank all of you for joining us today. There's no quick way to compress the last 20 years, but it was noted by Jelena that I was trained as a scientist and engineer at MIT, which is somewhat emblematic of many of the things that we're seeing. And so as I was beginning to think about what really the trends were that we're seeing now, is technology is having an enormous impact on arts education, hybridization and collaboration, social practice, social justice, and social media, which is also access to distribution channels that artists never had before. Typically through a gallery system or through a museum system is very different than being able to have access to millions of people. And please forgive me if I'm speaking about my students or community members in the third person, but one of the things that I have noticed over a 30-year career is that millennial students and Generation Z students have a very different orientation than the students that may have preceded them 20 years before and even earlier. Often our students now want their lives to have incredible and dramatic impact, for their lives to have meaning. Not that my generation didn't. I'm a creature of the 20th century, so I grew out of that same 19th century Beaux-Arts tradition of rigor. But we are also, all of us, on stage creatures of the 20th century and pioneers of the 21st, and so we have the capacity to sort of look at that. One of the interesting pieces of data is I was thinking about Roseann's comments, and I'll use one from my own university which may illustrate this, and it's not meant as an advertisement for VCU. We did some analysis recently, and VCU is in the top 100 of Research One universities in the world, and 61% of all of the out-of-state high SAT scores are in one school. and that's in the School of the Arts. And we have one of only 7 comprehensive medical schools in the United States. So often you will find colleagues that will say, well, we always knew that artists were smart, and I will stop them and I'll say, they're 17 years old, they are aspirants, they're not artists yet. What would be driving 61% of high SAT scores to be selecting to art school? And as we slowly start to see ourselves moving quite dramatically into a culture of innovation, and they have many pathways, right, to take through the educational system, post-secondary, I often begin to understand when I talk with them that they're exposed to and experiencing a world that requires the ability to deal with resilience, with ambiguity. It's the first generation that has to compete with cats on YouTube playing piano. I grew up in a world.
Memes are very important.
I grew up in a world with curated bodies of knowledge as an engineer that was, highly selected. Many of our students are multi-majors, and when I mean multi-majors, even 30 years ago, you might hear the word interdisciplinarity, you might hear the word multidisciplinarity, but that might have meant theater and film. Now it is dance and astrobiology, painting and neuroscience, cinema and gerontology. We recently did a search for a joint position between dance and kinetic imaging, which might otherwise be defined as computational arts. And all of the finalists, all 3 women, had MFAs in choreography and dance, but had PhDs in a technical field, typically engineering. And this is not an outlier. I think many of the students that we have now, part of these trends that we're seeing is that there's an incredible desire to feed the soul, to create sophisticated experiences and objects and works that feed the soul the same way that we have for thousands of years. But they also want to serve society in ways that not necessarily that there wasn't the desire for, but even the access for. And so there's an overarching sense of grand collaborations and the need and the hunger and the interest to partner with art, science, engineering, and medicine, and not like birds are to an ornithologist, but as true collaborators in deep collaboration. And in some ways, it's part of a new kind of creative ecosystem, and this is not techno-capitalistic speak. The School of the Arts has 2 of the sort of most interesting programs on our campus. One is the Da Vinci Center, which is a joint center between art, engineering, medicine, and business. And the other one, which is the Center for Creative Economy. National data in the US, SNAP data shows that 74% of the students who are tracking into the arts want to create their own businesses, not primarily to create a startup company and sell it and be subsumed by another big company, but really to understand the mechanics and the machinery of the world in which they're operating in. So these are just some very, very broad strokes of sort of the differences that I am observing and have observed in the last 30 years, but specifically, and I'll say the last 20, but with a focus on potentially the last 10.
Thank you, Shawn. I also wanted to raise the question of, since here the US is overwhelmingly represented, but we're fortunate that both David and Marta are coming from Europe. So I wanted to ask you, Marta, about the differences between the way that art is taught in Europe versus in the States. And also, do you also see some common trends that are very dominant that sort of overcome these boundaries that are just global trends?
Well, I don't know if I can be as ambitious as to be, or presumptuous to know what the difference is in terms of students of graduate visual art programs and the differences between what they are in the United States and where I have, in a limited way, taught or been a curator, because actually I'm not only the first woman dean at the Yale School of Art, I'm also the first dean who has not been an artist, who comes into the position as a curator and as a theorist. I'm going to actually backtrack on your question and try to answer it by positing myself in the midst of my two peer colleagues in saying that the link between Europe and the United States and the notion of there being any kind of new movements in art education have also had pressure linked from political exile and from the notion of utopian thinking about the future, and that from that we do have the early German romantics through Novalis and the Schlegel brothers, and something really extraordinary in terms of something called the Athenaeum Fragment, which only lasted for a period of time but set out a kind of radical approach to process and thinking about the concept, new genres and concepts of art. But then you have Soviet constructivism, which was a place where artists were actually working with ideologues and also with city officials and governments officials in order to foster what would be the thinking of a new society. You have, of course, Bauhaus coming out of that. And then all of this where we end up with some place like the Black Mountain College, where several exiles got together and started to think about what we know as transdisciplinarity. But what I would also like to add is that between the history that you set out so generously and the technological future that we're in and the ambitions of that, we have something called 1989, and we have the fall of the Berlin Wall, and we have the collapse of what is known as previously the East and the West. And we have with that the collapse of a Western dominant modernism. And with the rise of a Western dominant modernism, we have the growth and the increase of a discussion and address of many different modernisms that happen throughout and internationally. And with that, and not surprisingly, you have the growth of global capital, right? So you have these two very important strains happening at the same time. And with that, you have the birth of so many biennials and something called manifesta as an itinerant biennial. The scales of production change. The spatial temporal paradigms for art change dramatically since 1989. And with that becomes the convergence of something we know as the global international exhibition, and where we sit right now, that we are here together in Doha, Qatar, and we may equally speak about what is happening in Kerala in terms of the biennial as we are in other places. And I think that's a very interesting pressure that is putting on any art institution, because any American art institution has to cope with the fact that any production that is coming out and produced by a graduate art student will eventually be shown or placed if anyone is wanting to be part of the world with that dialogue. And so I would say the difference is there's a strong similarity of an impulse toward individuality that will not succumb anywhere. I think that is clear for any artist that's still claiming themselves within the field of art. And it is something within the Yale School of Art, for example, from the place where I'm now practicing. It's a Beaux-Arts example of an institution that collided with somebody called Joseph Albers in 1950, who decided to collapse the disciplines of painting and photography and sculpture into graphic art, which still adheres. I mean, it's taught differently. So it's important also in terms of individuals bringing change to art education. And we see that throughout with anywhere from Joseph Beuys in the Akademie der Kunst in Düsseldorf to John Baldessari to Michael Asher. And that importance of the individual in bringing change to art education is still very, very important.
Thank you. That gives us quite an overview from the academic side and also historical perspective of how things have been going on. So I will address the next question to you, David, since you come, or most of what you have done has been outside of academia, both as a craftsman, as a furniture maker, but also as a chairman of Christie's. So how do you perceive developments in art education? Are they catering to the needs of the industry?
I think that's a really interesting, I mean, I'm not an academic at all. I'm deeply indebted to the knowledge they've just given me. So I stand from a completely different perspective where I see what experiences my sister, who's an artist, or my wife, who's an artist, have gone through in terms of their education.
Does that mean you don't consider yourself an artist?
No, no. I was trained as a cabinet maker, and there is a distinction between artists and craftsmen. And we were taught how to, in a practical sense, make something, whereas an artist is somebody who creates an idea and then makes it.
Would you call yourself a designer?
Maybe a designer craftsman.
Designer craftsman, yes. I'm asking because
very
these
serious.
are
Don't give up,
interesting
don't give up.
distinctions.
No,
Don't
primarily,
give into
from my perspective, where I was taught by a magnificent craftsman. And two of them had very different approaches. One was very industrial and mechanical and technological. And the other was from the 19th century, who insisted on us using completely Victorian handmade tools. And each one had a really good resonance on me, because I'm both technologically interested and very sort of traditional. So I think in the way that I've sort of had an overview whilst working at Christie's, looking at people's education in the art sort of schools that I see, there seems to be very much the Slade, St. Martin's, Central St. Martin's school of thinking about ideas and creating ideas. And then there's the group of smaller, such as the Royal Drawing School, which have smaller ambitions, but people are coming to them now to actually learn how to do the craft of drawing, which seems to be overshadowed by the larger schools who are interested in the ideas.
So is the situation such that these days there are more and more people being interested in crafts than there were?
I think there are more and more. I mean, I have a tiny shop where people are coming to see things because it says, please touch, right? So often nowadays, our only interaction with touch is a screen. And I think there's a real hunger for people to actually feel something that's been made. And you can feel that there's been that relationship between the hand, either the chisel or the material, and the human brain. And I think that's what people are beginning to get a real hunger for. In this increased digitized world, actually it's a wonderful relief to go home and actually feel that table was made by somebody, and I know who it was. And I think that relationship will continue to grow.
Right. Oh, great. In everything you've been saying, I was also trying to see, because you address very different issues, and we talked about history of the development of the field. I'm curious, more and more you hear comments that art schools are killing creativity, for instance, and individuality and originality and so on. Do you feel that, and I'll pose this to everyone, do you feel that art schools these days are indeed diminishing students' creativity and imagination and so on, or is this absolutely wrong?
I've just been to the Royal College of Art recently, the Royal Academy in London, and both of them, I came away completely inspired by what I saw in terms of the students showing what they were capable of doing. Because when I was a student, and I am a very shy person, I was very, very reticent to actually meet a client, which is a bit of a disadvantage. Whereas what I've found is that they've been trained in so much more about how they go out into the world, how they promote themselves, how they create their digital marketing, and that they have an advantage, that they have the confidence that my generation certainly wasn't encouraged to do. So I think that certainly what I've seen recently in London, I'm very encouraged by the creativity. I think as you were saying about the different crafts coming together, and there is a confluence, where there's a creative balance between the people who are doing technologically and interesting new things, advanced technologies, but also mastered with people who make things using things made by hand.
Right.
I think there's also a very important role that art plays in fostering imagination, which is necessary in any discipline. And so therefore, in our school, since we are posited within a larger research university, we try to bring together the MFA students with, for example, students of, Hito Steil was a visiting professor, and I don't know if any of you know of her work, but she's very interested in, data and artificial intelligence and how that enters into her practice, but again, by looking at the haptic and looking at the notions of human individuality. And we brought her in, and she decided to have a cooperation with the specialists in blockchain at the School of Management in a cryptocurrency workshop. And so we had MFA students together with leading financial specialists who are PhD candidates, and they spoke about not specifically about cryptocurrency, because that's something sort of amorphous in its making, but about new forms of social contract and about trust. And it was through the intervention of an artist that the discussion could be brought out to the abstract and then fostered ideas around it, explored through the artist's intervention in that.
It sounds as if you're saying that the way out of this old criticism that art schools are stifling creativity is that these days art schools are applying so many different new approaches that are alternative, that are stimulating thought and critical inquiry and combining various fields of life. Is that sort of the main trend these days in art schools? What would you say?
Well, I would say in our case, the school continues to get more and more selective. And so the students are coming, when we look at the portfolios of what's been submitting, a lot of the faculty joke that maybe they wouldn't get in now. It's really extraordinary what a global exposure to art has done for so many young people, and opportunities to learn art in new ways that aren't necessarily only through their existing schools. But I think that what has happened is the definition of art education has broadened so much that if you just take in the simplest form the notion of an artist sitting down with a blank piece of paper and making something that's never existed before, that's what artists do day in and day out. And that process is very frightening. It's very scary for shy people or for bold people. But it is that sense of reinvention every time. And so we have students that come through that are interested in becoming practicing artists and designers in a more traditional way. We also have a number of students that are interested in the sort of entrepreneurial role, and we recently did a survey and found that 45% of our alumni who responded had either started a new business or organization, and 45% is higher than the statistics at Harvard or MIT. So these are really entrepreneurial kids. And then there's a third piece, which is the partnership piece, which is, I think, what you're talking about. And we've often been parts of grant proposals or partnerships where companies or organizations will come to us and want to work with artists and designers because they think that the artists or the designers are going to be able to help visualize the material they're producing. And what they end up finding out is that, in fact, when the artists or designers are at the forefront of the thinking expands phenomenally. And so rather than looking at design or art as problem solving, it's about problem framing, but it's also about a different kind of cycle of idea generation. Mm-hmm. So for example, we have students who are working with West Point cadets looking at things around safety and nuclear preparation. We have students and faculty working on a research project thinking about creating new habitats for shellfish and coastal climate change. We have many social projects dealing with social justice issues and helping to rebuild cities around community centers and art centers. We have the Drug Enforcement Agency was recently came to do a workshop where they asked us to model out some different ideas of how they could stop drug trafficking. And coming to artists and designers rather than to politicians or to even social scientists, created all kinds of ideas that they had never imagined, and just the iteration of how it's visualized was using methodologies that they'd never used. So the idea of how artists and designers can intervene in terms of solving big world problems or promoting harmonious solutions to things that are kind of daunting realities is becoming more and more apparent. And so it's broadening the role of what art institutions can do.
I was musing as I was listening to David earlier. But because the art school actually was not designed in a way to train me, educate me, or introduce me to a way to realize the things that I was imagining. And so in many ways, the art school becomes not a place on exposing you what to think or imagine, but how to think and to imagine. And we all went to institutions that claimed, and many of us in the room did, that those institutions were places where anything was possible. And I can wink and nod at everyone. I'm watching David smile, because there's a huge difference, right? Because ultimately, you know, most of us bashed our heads against the wall to get the institution to bend, to yield even just a tiny bit to allow us to become who we imagined that we would become. So now we're stewards, right? Whether or not we're in the academy or not, whether we provide a platform for creative practice, where we're building organizations where the outcome is not possible, but where it's likely. And the mathematical delta between possible and likely is quite significant. And the organizational changes, the built-in inertia, all of our history, right? We have a 40,000-year portfolio. When I walk on a campus and I'm next to my colleagues, I'm not smug, but I feel incredible pride. I can go to my colleagues in medicine and say, show me your 19th century surgical wing, and they don't have one. Right? That was obliterated, and we all are required to do now, but a lot of us are required to do the future now. And so the art school becomes this extraordinary place, which gave me, in many ways, the brass to imagine that I could just show up at MIT, right? And you know, dock up next to a scientist or an engineer, discover at the same rate, at the same speed, at the same sort of level of curiosity. At VCU, one of the sort of another artifact that begins to show what many of my colleagues are kind of laying out for everyone. The Dean of Engineering, for example, Barbara Boyan, comes from the humanities through biology into engineering, right? The Dean of Business actually comes from Disney. Of course, the Dean from art comes from science and engineering, and the CEO of the medical campus comes through creative writing. So all of the nests of origin are quite different on a campus, like you might find like ours. Similar to Roseann, VCU has actually 20 active research projects with the medical school, 4 clinically funded trials, very unlike any other institution that I know of. We have a physician scientist residency program, and this is not for sensitivity training for the physicians or to put paintings or to decide the color of paint inside of the hospital. We have active projects in palliative care, cancer research. Medical schools are witnessing one of the highest burnout and suicide rates that we've ever noticed in history. We have an 18-bed simulation theater for reintroducing touch to young physicians. Typically, they calculated that they will interrupt the patient within 6 seconds, and one of the very first things that they do is they request labs and imaging, and they don't touch, right? And so all of these places, it's not so much that the art school becomes a magical amulet for solving problems, but again, it becomes this extraordinary pathway into a world of complex, uncurated knowledge, and students increasingly find it as the environment that will give them the greatest capacity for deciphering and succeeding.
It sounds like the boundaries are being blurred progressively between fields, and not just that you don't need to go to an art school to be an artist, but you can also come from a very different field into another profession. Do you feel this is the future of education, that the boundaries between fields will be broken? And that there will be something else that will take them, like specific skills or critical thinking as such?
Jelena, if I could interrupt you for a moment here, because I think there is this preconception, and maybe I'm thinking about an MFA program, that artists enter into a program in order to become artists. And we had a beautiful speech given by Fred Moten at our commencement last May, and he made it very clear that artists actually don't go to MFA programs to become artists. They already are artists when they go into the art education program. They go in to actually focus and be able, and for a myriad of reasons that we don't even know why they go to schools, because they take on, with entering into schools, obviously debt if they're going to American schools. So that when they arrive into schools, they are not only thinking about how I can potentially grow, how do I cope with being an artist and being responsible to the society, the global society, under its current social, economic, political, in its social, political, economic landscape. And I think that when I meet with students in my class, and I meet with students, 60 students every autumn, I have a class in critical practice, that is their challenge, is how do I come to terms with the fact that I am this person that has no other option than to be an artist. It's sort of like the James Baldwin discussion about you have no choice if you are an artist. But then how do you cope with all of the responsibilities you have as a human being? And so I don't find that students that I'm encountering in an MFA program or in a postgraduate program are actually worried about their creativity being encroached. It's how can they actually be a human being and continue in this area that they necessarily don't have a control over in being.
Yes.
Yeah, and I don't think the boundaries are necessarily breaking down. I think they're just pushing broader. I mean, I do believe it's really important, at least our philosophy is that there's an incredible value to rigor. And so our first year students are still drawing 10 hours a week by hand. And they also are learning coding, and they're using coding more the way they would use charcoal. They're using it as a tool rather than as an end result. But the notion that that sense of embodied learning, the kind of craftsman-like approach to connecting your hand and your brain and your eye and your heart all together, that comes from practice, and it's a physical exercise, and it's an exercise of making. And I think some art schools are choosing to lessen their emphasis on that. We're not, because it's the core of who we are. And from that, once you master that, once you learn how to actually make anything that's in your mind, you can apply that to any of these different fields or excursions outside of your studied discipline. But without that, there's a level of superficiality that can be dangerous. So I still think the rigor is incredibly important, and the word practice is there because it's about practicing over and over again and really pulling yourself out of mediocrity, which is a very difficult thing generationally right now. Students have this particular generation that you were talking about has wonderful assets that were not in other generations, but one of the challenges they face is this ability to focus that long because they're so multilingual with things happening at the same time, and they're curating their lives while they're also making something or studying something. And that's a different set of pressures. But the notion of actually having to focus on something for a long period of time past the point of comfort is often where new ideas come from, because your body sort of kicks in when you're overwhelmed by something and you feel like you've done enough. If you can just force yourself a little bit further to focus, that's often where new ideas come from. And that's something that is connected to a rigorous practice, and education, I believe, should still include those, particularly at the undergraduate level. And at the graduate level, I think it's similar, but it's in a more self-directed way.
That's really interesting. David, as a practicing craftsman, do you feel that this physicality of what you do is also opening up these spaces for reflection? Is this the process? Is how you see it?
Yes, I mean, a little tiny bit of self-promotion. I actually have my own little school as well. But they are more and more being attended by people of second careerists, people who've had a job, been able to afford to get to a certain point in life, and now they want to do something they really want to do. So I think from the perspective of finding a beautiful piece of timber, let's say, and making an object, there is a certain satisfaction that you don't get from being in a normal day-to-day job in an office, let's say. So I think there is beginning to be a sort of a burgeoning group of people over the age of about 40 who want to actually get satisfaction of what they do and actually be able to go home and say, this is what I've created, rather than just taking home a wage. And I think that's because, you know, we now get to a stage where people can afford to do that.
Do you believe that that physical aspect is important? Because as we see, a lot of art being produced these days is not as tangible.
That's right. I mean, Christy sold the other day an AI work of art, first time. But I think that the tangible thing is so important. And what I'm seeing, and certainly in the schools that I've been going around, is that people want to get engaged with the reality of, not the theory, they want to get the reality back again. And so many people from my generation were denied the opportunity of actually drawing. So they're finding these artists, and an artist friend of mine said that she gets young students knocking on the door at night saying, please, can you teach me to draw? Because the schools are not allowing them to do that because they're so obsessed by their agenda.
Yeah, and I think there's an important distinction between the learning and the making. So, you know, I think it's possible that many artists are doing incredible work where they're not touching anything, they're not making anything, but there's a certain kind of a certain way of informing oneself that comes, I think, from that rigorous practice position, and then you can choose to express it in multiple ways. And you know, from I mean, there are temporal pieces that aren't the pieces themselves aren't lasting. Some of the AI work that we're seeing is in that realm, but also a lot of performance work and other kinds of engagements, community engagements that are not meant to be lasting works of art, but it's still that foundational education that allows versatility and a really kind of fluency with ideas that I believe results from that early kind of rigorous practice.
I'm interested in, so there's a project that we're working on, and hybridization doesn't necessarily, the way in which I'm defining it, mean between multiple disciplines. It actually can be inside of a single discipline. And I'm actually thinking of design practice. So we're working on an area called affective design or arousal state design. So for example, a furniture maker could be creating an object, but we actually use telemetry sensors on their body, and we're measuring all of their arousal state, from their respiration to galvanic skin temperature to dilation of the pupils, all of that. And then that data is run through a small neural network, and it's trained basically to have parametric control over computer software that will make 100 or 10 versions of what you've actually made by hand. But because the way in which artists produce, the idea that the body actually has deep somatic knowledge in the practice of making, right? That by taking all of that knowledge, but using technology to give in essence, yourself multiple variants on your own project or on your own practice simultaneously is fascinating. So it's hybridizing it very, very manual process. But in the same token, it's introducing you to versions of yourself, right? And of your own somatic engagement with your creative practice. And not so much that you would select and choose, I want one of these, I want one of these, but it does expand the way in which the body, we understand the body. So even in our foundations, of course, we teach drawing, we teach all of those, but we also teach somatic awareness, we teach improvisation, through music. There's a whole range of activities. And so there is a kind of a convergence, a hybridization between the physical and the virtual that's fairly extraordinary. And I could point to lots and lots of projects. One of the things that I was going to say just a moment ago, and was thinking a little bit back on some of the conversation, while it may seem like I'm either focusing or promoting technology, the millennial Gen Z mindset, often when you get to the bottom of their creative practice, I'll just choose one designer in mind, there's usually a story, and a story is driving some of the impulse behind that. So we have a group of fashion students, engineering students, and medical students that are inventing inflatable underwear. When you are typically a senior, you can fall and break any number of bones in the body, and your ability to thrive is quite similar to any other age. But if you fracture a hip, failure to thrive is quite significant. So these garments actually sense an unsustainable fall, and they will inflate immediately and protect the hip from breaking. But when you get to this, it's not a student sitting down and saying, I want to invent this because I want to make money. They've typically had a parent or a grandparent write a story that's actually had an experience, and somehow they're deriving from their art practice, which is usually self-guided, and they're their own client, but they want to deploy and mobilize the knowledge from their creative practice to serve society in ways that they never had. And many times this sense of that monastic skill, right, that may be trained through direct contact, now through collaboration has a way to more, I won't say more quickly, but there's an advantage to being able to have teams of people from different micro-languages and areas of expertise to explore these ideas very, very fast and to mobilize this knowledge in ways that we haven't, which is one of the interesting points that I was hoping to bring up earlier, which is about the distribution channel, the ability for someone to have access to millions of people, billions of people simultaneously.
It's fascinating discussion. We can go into depth on this subject, but since we're running out of time, I would like to just wrap the discussion with a question of what do you believe the future holds for art education? We didn't talk very much about evolving technologies and their role in art education, but maybe just for the end, if I could ask each of you to invite you to say a few words about what do you think the future holds. Yes.
I think it looks very bright. I mean, I think that, I've learned an enormous amount this afternoon, so that's added to my knowledge. But from what I've seen previously, I think that we will always, as human beings, be curious, and we will always want to invent something that people haven't invented before. And I think that with all this raft of new information, I think that the young today have never had a better opportunity of striving in the worlds of art and design and craft. And I think that there's, every, good chance that the world will become a better place where there's a balance between the people who make mass-produced things and the people who make art-derived objects.
True. Absolutely true. Thank you.
Well, I would agree. I think that that as we were talking about boundaries expanding, that the influence that artists can have and the teams that artists and designers are part of now offer great opportunities for creative change. And every industry, every way of working, the way that people are living is all radically changed, and it's changing at increased rates of speed, but also the challenges that come with those are changing. And there have to be individuals who can visualize change, and you started with the word imagination. I think the cultivation of imagination, which happens in many kinds of programs, but in particular in art and design programs means that, you know, we often say that our students can see around corners. They can see what's coming where others can't, because they've spent so much time developing their perceptual and cognitive abilities through the path of education that they followed. So that form of thinking, that form of flexibility, that nimble thinking, that creativity is going to be more and more important as things advance and as they advance globally, so that people can be connected through other forms of language that are visual and computational and experiential.
Thank you.
Again, I suppose I'm going to go round robin about something. I mean, I'm going to go through the contemporary arts world and note that, you know, in the last two decades, we've seen an incredible increase of the educational turn within art, so that so many museums and so many exhibiting institutions are now turning to the models of education as exhibition models. So there has been, you see all of a sudden something as in distribution channels, eFlux. You know, eFlux is an informational distribution channel about exhibitions. Well, eFlux launched Art and Education, which is as active as the exhibition channel. So that with the educational turn within the contemporary arts model, that is only fueling more interest in how education can be an instrument in developing and exhibiting and thinking of other models for contemporary art exhibition. And with that, I would say that I've also noticed that many of our graduates, their primary concern is to go on to be an educator or to be a pedagogue. And the primary point is not to seek a gallery for exhibition. They feel confident that if they can settle and address their role as an educator, the rest will somehow work out. And that's incredibly encouraging.
Well, yes.
Yeah, I want to thank my colleagues, not just for letting me be the cleanup batter, but for such an illuminating conversation. As you can see, it's multivalent. The one thing that I think it would be important for me to note is that we're in Qatar, right? And the National Museum of Qatar opens in just a few days. And that the School of the Arts is the oldest campus or the oldest university in Education City. And increasingly, Education City becomes almost a location or a place where what you can't do on any one campus that I know of anywhere, right? You can almost imagine that it could happen here. And as I begin to think of the idea of the future, it's an extraordinary opportunity where you have a country that's opening a national museum that will look at its heritage retrospectively, but you have such a young country where the cultural production, right, ultimately can become its heritage. And so you have the opportunity where the art school becomes a prospective, not an instrumentalized vehicle, right, but a generator of heritage, but in a way that's not just one in a rearview mirror, but one that's actually forward based on many of the themes that we've talked about. I probably don't want to wax too philosophic here, but we're more than 100-year biological vessels, right? That means that, you know, I might do a little more, you might do a little less. We're million-year creatures embedded in a billion-year process. And if we get too carefully hung up or too overly hung up on galleries, museums, etc., what it really means to be human, to discover what it means to be human is really what artists do. And to document that, the history of the arts is the avant-garde, which is really to shatter any previous known paradigm of what it is that we thought we were, and then to document that in ways that are both radical and enduring. As I mentioned earlier, that 40,000-year portfolio is an extraordinary tradition and an extraordinary legacy. And I see it uniquely animated here on this campus, especially in a country where, as I said earlier, that its future is its heritage. and the culture of production becomes central to imagining that. And I think the art school is not an outside player, the jewel in the crown, but a finger on the hand that wields the hammer that builds empires.
Absolutely. And just to continue what you were saying, for everyone's information, in case this was not communicated, the National Museum of Qatar will open on the 28th, on Thursday. So I hope that everyone will come and visit it and see how much of new technologies and new approaches in museum education are being embedded in this museum as well. But I would like to also, we are running slightly behind schedule, but I promise that we will have question and answer session at the end. So I would like to give the audience a chance to ask 2 or 3 questions of our panelists. Yes.
Thank you very much. This is very educational. This question goes maybe to the professors, maybe Kuzma and Brixey. It's about, I see with generations, like, for example, the baby boomers were mostly a Western term, and then you had Generation X, which I come from, where the world was becoming smaller and we were a little bit more exposed to each other. And then you have the millennials and then the Generation Z. And with time, I'm seeing that you know, the new generations are aspiring to the same heroes and to the same idols, and they're becoming a smaller society, you know, in terms of what they're exposed to. They're playing the same games, they're listening to the same music, they're wearing the same clothes. And that worries me a little bit about the future of art. You know, the world was beautiful when you could separate the Middle Eastern art from the European Western art, from the African, from South American, and then now, I think going forward, if we leave media and social media and to control, I think the kids will be all the same artists, doing the same thing. So as educators and professors, is anything done
I understand
to do that?
That might be your fear, and I am also very fearful of social media and its impact, and I feel as though just as artists in the 1960s were very concentrated on a critique of communications and information, I believe I try to bring to the attention of my students that you must be as critical in the way that you communicate and think about the way you communicate as embedded as part of your process. So although I respect your fear, which could also be anyone's fear, when I go to a studio visit, I notice that it is very rare to have 2 artists that tell the same story, and each have a story to narrate, and they struggle with embedding that story within their work. And I think the biggest struggle is to abstract from that particular story and to find some universal from that story. So I would say it's actually opposite, that there are so many stories to tell, and there are so many individuals that adhere to their personal and specific story, that it's important that they know that they can be relational, and they can be relevant, and they can find a connection to others. So even though they communicate in the same way, they have very unique backgrounds.
The word universal is what scares me.
The what?
The word universal. You said universal, right? You said universal communication. For
I
example,
would say not a universal form, but a way to feel part of the world,
let's look
and
at,
not separate and therefore adamant.
As an example only, it's not the only example, but we have many. But calligraphy, for example. Calligraphy was a big thing in our region, in the Arab world. And today, I don't see any new young calligraphers. You know, there's some left in Persia or in Turkey, but not in the Arab world, for example, because it's not appealing now to be a calligrapher. So I think it's a responsibility of institutes like VCU to produce kids today that doesn't have the same skill set or the art vision that today the Virginia, for example, VCU student will have. You know, I think we have to pay attention to these things. Like you said, universal maybe. Calligraphy could not maybe be something that, and I'm not saying in only Arabic calligraphy, it could be Chinese or Japanese calligraphy or anything like that, and which has been an art for hundreds and hundreds of years. If this disappears, okay, then we're becoming more and more universal, like you said.
But I believe also that there is something like, there's the historical dialectic of ornament, for example. So for example, what has been ornament at one time then is no longer ornament, and then what isn't ornament evolves into ornament. You know, it's like, it's cyclical.
Yeah, but
so for example, what someone might not find interesting to approach today may, in some period of time, return back. You know, the ICA in London, which is a contemporary arts institution, was formed out of a grassroots movement in London of designers, architects, artists that wanted to take things back to the street, that wanted to return things back to the haptic, that wanted to take away from this idea of, you know, the world going forward in a progressive way. And so we forget the fact that someplace which is known as the ICA in London has those kinds of, you know, community roots, and in terms of also technique. And so many students I see are grappling with how do they deal with patterns? How do they deal with textiles? How do they incorporate this into their work without it referring back to kitsch or those? And I think it's just a matter of keeping, and this is why the thinking and the reading becomes important. Because if you think and you read and you see historical models, you will see that we have been there before. And there has been Adolf Loos that wanted to say that modernism is just, you know, great white walls and devoid of ornament. We have been there before. So I think that we should be more concerned about our fears taking over rather than this being played out.
I have a story, but I'll make it very short because I know that everyone has other things to do, but I very much appreciate your sensitive question. I was at another university when a donor, one of the consulate generals of another country, donated 2 gamelan to our music department. And if you know what a gamelan is, it's a 5-tone South Asian instrument. It's very unique in terms of, especially even to the Western ear. And much to probably the disappointment of me, my faculty set about designing curriculum. This is not too dissimilar from calligraphy. Curriculum, a long panel of distinguished guests, right, to design a curriculum for the gamelan, clearly because we had student populations that came from regions of the world where there must be an appetite for this. Now, in this particular institution, when you create a curriculum, if the courses fail to load or enroll, the dean actually pays full salary for all of the faculty, regardless if there are any students or not. Well, I could see this careening out of control, but the only lesson that I could share with my colleagues was to let them do this. So they spent an entire year developing curriculum around this. The courses opened, no one enrolled, no matter how much we advertised, and there was significant advertising. I called the chair of the cinema program and I said, would you please do me a kindness? Will you have the gamelan occur in one film within 20% of the first 5 classes, which had 4,000 students in them? It didn't take more than 30 seconds for a student to raise their hand, film stops, and the professor says, may I help you? And the student says, what is that? And then the professor says, of course, that's a gamelan. Right, and then they roll on for another 2 or 3 minutes, and then another student raises their hand and says, do we have one? And then pretty soon, can we get it out of the closet? And can we start using it? So from the old model that I was educated in, that I'm an empty cup, and you pour me out, and then you fill me up, millennials and Gen Zs, if you approach it that way, it's an obstacle. They'll go around it, they'll go over it, they'll go under it. They'll do anything other than go directly the way in which you assume that they would go. But if you meet them where they are, right, they will. They will become probably even more passionate and capable than anyone from my generation in terms of the interest in the form. The last note, and it's hard to wrangle all of this together because we've had such beautiful ideas, and your point is so extremely well taken. Some of it is cultural value, that value is promoted significantly enough to where there's a desire and an appetite. But you think of Gutenberg, right? When he invented the, sort of the printing press, and there's lots of lead up to that, but I'm just using him as a sort of as a model. There's the utopic energy that comes from the ability to communicate broadly and to everyone so that they can read. But the dystopic reality is that it disrupted the church, it disrupted the monarchy, and the wavelength of that utopic energy to the dystopic reality was hundreds of years. Now we live in a world where increasingly the utopic energy of what's possible with all of these great tools and the dystopic reality that you're starting to fear, they start touching one another. And to use a physicist term, they can be in superposition or they can actually be ahead of one another. The dystopic reality sets in even before the utopic possibility of something that could happen. And I won't say that art schools are on guard for this, but we've learned through all different kinds of mechanisms. If we attempt to force our students to do a particular thing because we value that, it doesn't always work. But if we share our values and we expose them widely in our passions, all of our history, and we trust them, because this is an investment in themselves, and it's their first great investment, they will gravitate towards the things that they're passionate about. And they will do them at often depths that we see in our studio practices, at much greater depths than I had seen in many, many, many years of teaching and doing administrative work.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Thank you so much, all of you. My question is specifically for Marta and Roseann. I was wondering if you could speak to the responsibility of the art school towards its students in terms of teaching them to be ethical, responsible human beings, because especially today, particularly in the US, where schools are under scrutiny, especially when it seems like they, any kind of act that occurs on a campus by the administration and the faculty is so scrutinized. Every tiny detail of it is thought out. And students kind of are very politically charged in order to address these. And I think in an arts program, students find this communal space or like an educational space as a place to talk about and process these things. But that kind of training becomes very difficult because it's not exactly quantified or easily described. So if I could just get, your take on the role of the university in that, or the art school.
Well, I can maybe give an example of the landscape, but I think I can also be joined by my colleagues here who probably experience this on a daily basis as well. I think on some level, I have a connection with 120 MFA students, and then there are about 35, 50 undergraduate students. So in that way, I consider myself fortunate as a dean because I can actually pretty much reach out or listen if there's some kind of issue that comes up. I will give another example from personal experience that brings me a bit closer to what's going on is I'm also a professor of critical practice for 60 incoming first-year students that come from each discipline. So it's the one class that all the departments meet together. And in that class, we don't necessarily speak about art. I mean, it comes into play. We speak about what is actually going on in the world and read historical texts and contemporary texts. We might read Donna Haraway and then go harvest at the Yale farm, just to think while we're doing something. And that helps me understand what is going on. every so often there is something that happens that is, you know, you need to take it apart and you need to address it. And principally, the mode that we do that within is holding either a town hall within a given department, if something happens within a given department, in order to address that issue so that everyone partakes in that discussion. If it's a wider university issue, it goes from the point of the university and then it's discussed individually within the school. But I would say, yes, we have a responsibility to addressing each and every issue, and it is, we live in a time where nothing can be neglected. I mean, really, every discussion, every expression has to be considered, and that takes in a huge amount of time on the part of a school. You know, any one issue could take 2 weeks of studio practice time, faculty time to unpack. But because that is being unpacked, I am surprised how quiet the campus is in this day and age. You know, I mean, we're coming from a campus that in 1970 nearly burned down before and had the National Guard on its campus prior to the shooting at Kent State. You know, it didn't happen in New Haven, but those times happened. I think everyone has a memory of that period of time and to understand that things can really blow up. I don't know if that answered your question, but maybe.
It's a great question. I think it's really a driving question about contemporary education. And I think part of it is that we're on the precipice of pedagogical change. So there are faculty who have come into the institution with one form of teaching practice, and students are expecting something different.
Yes.
And particularly when you're a global institution. So we're doing a lot of effort right now we're actually releasing our faculty from a course to have them take a course in inclusive teaching pedagogy to really change the examples of who they're showing and how they're talking about role models and examples, et cetera. We also have a requirement, 1/3 of our credits are in the liberal arts, so there's a lot of context given through history and social science and philosophy and others. But I think the pedagogy is really the key turning point. I think the other thing is finding forums for open discussion and then setting examples as an institution. So for example, we source all of our food in the cafeterias from local farmers, and the students have their own garden where they can, you know, grow things to eat. And it may sound like a kind of luxury, but it actually talks about a form of sustainability that we're living in the institution as well as in our utility and energy use. We're trying to model those things because institutions are communities. And so if we can build our own community to model the issues that are important to students, they then can use that as a laboratory for developing their own thinking. And ultimately, you know, that's what a school is. So it's important. And then the last thing I would say is that there's a really interesting role as a president where we're expected to respond to every single political thing that happens in the globe, and the students will write me and say, why haven't you written a letter about this, and where does the institution stand? And so I was getting really frustrated by the fact that I could be writing a letter every other day because there's so much happening.
Exactly.
So we called the students together and said, let's talk about using your voices, your particular talents to make expressions about these things. And so for example, around gun violence, we did a digital gun violence quilt, which is made of all different pieces of work around the notion of gun violence that we'll be opening as a projection and then hopefully having wider exposure on the anniversary of the Columbine shooting, so that the students actually feel like they're part of the message and part of the voice. And in that process, and this is the final thing I'll say about this, in the last year, we sat down as a community of administrators, faculty, staff, and students and developed a one-page system of values for the institution. And everyone had input into that. And so now we can sort of just articulate that all of our decision-making has to be concordant with those values. And that makes it much simpler and more clear to see what we stand for and what our educational model is about. So hopefully that answers.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We could talk much more, but considering that we went over time, I would like to thank our panel for their contribution and also for really fascinating comments and ideas and projections for the future. And thank you very much for being here, for being part of this series, which are called Qatar Creates talks. This is the first of the 16 panels and talks we will have this week between now and Friday. And they're organized in celebration of the opening of the National Museum of Qatar. And I hope that I will see you all at the National Museum of Qatar very soon. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.